The Dark Enlightenment Part 1, Neo-reactionaries head for the exit. Nick Land. Enlightenment is not only a state, but an event, and a process. As the designation for an historical episode, concentrated in Northern Europe during the 18th century, it is a leading candidate for the true name of modernity, capturing its origin and essence. Renaissance and Industrial Revolution are others. Between Enlightenment and Progressive Enlightenment there is only an elusive difference, because illumination takes time, and feeds on itself, because Enlightenment is self-confirming, its revelation self-evident, and because a retrograde, or reactionary, Dark Enlightenment amounts almost to intrinsic contradiction. To become enlightened, in this historical sense, is to recognize, and then to pursue, a guiding light. There were ages of darkness, and then enlightenment came. Clearly advance has demonstrated itself, offering not only improvement, but also a model. Furthermore, unlike a Renaissance, there is no need for an enlightenment to recall what was lost, or to emphasize the attractions of return. The elementary acknowledgement of enlightenment is already Whig history in miniature. Once certain enlightened truths have been found self-evident, there can be no turning back, and conservatism is preemptively condemned, predestined, to paradox. F. A. Hayek, who refused to describe himself as a conservative, famously settled instead upon the term Old Whig, which, like classical liberal, or the still more melancholy remnant, accepts that progress isn't what it used to be. What could an Old Whig be, if not a reactionary progressive? And what on earth is that? Of course, plenty of people already think they know what reactionary modernism looks like, and amidst the current collapse back into the 1930s their concerns are only likely to grow. Basically, it's what the F word is for, at least in its progressive usage. A flight from democracy under these circumstances conforms so perfectly to expectations that it eludes specific recognition, appearing merely as an atavism, or confirmation of dire repetition. Still, something is happening, and it is, at least in part, something else. One milestone was the April 2009 discussion hosted at Cato Unbound among libertarian thinkers, including Patrick Friedman and Peter Thiel, in which disillusionment with the direction and possibilities of democratic politics was expressed with unusual forthrightness. Thiel summarized the trend bluntly: "I no longer believe that freedom and democracy are compatible." In August 2011, Michael Lind posted a Democratic repost at Salon, digging up some impressively malodorous dirt, and concluding, "The dread of democracy by libertarians and classical liberals is justified. Libertarianism really is incompatible with democracy. Most libertarians have made it clear which of the two they prefer. The only question that remains to be settled is why anyone should pay attention to libertarians." Lind and the neo-reactionaries seem to be in broad agreement that democracy is not only, or even, a system, but rather a vector, with an unmistakable direction. Democracy and progressive democracy are synonymous, and indistinguishable from the expansion of the state. Whilst extreme right-wing governments have, on rare occasions, momentarily arrested this process, its reversal lies beyond the bounds of democratic possibility. Since winning elections is overwhelmingly a matter of vote buying, and society's informational organs, education and media, are no more resistant to bribery than the electorate, a thrifty politician is simply an incompetent politician, and the democratic variant of Darwinism quickly eliminates such misfits from the gene pool. This is a reality that the left applauds, the establishment right grumpily accepts, and the libertarian right has ineffectively railed against. Increasingly, however, libertarians have ceased to care whether anyone is paying them attention. They have been looking for something else entirely, an exit. It is a structural inevitability that the libertarian voice is drowned out in democracy, and according to Lind it should be. Ever more libertarians are likely to agree. Voice is democracy itself, in its historically dominant, Rousseauistic strain. It models the state as a representation of popular will, and making oneself heard means more politics. If voting as the mass self-expression of politically empowered peoples is a nightmare engulfing the world, adding to the hubbub doesn't help. Even more than equality versus liberty, voice versus exit is the rising alternative, and libertarians are opting for voiceless flight. Patrick Friedman remarks, "We think that free exit is so important that we've called it the only universal human right." For the hardcore neo-reactionaries, democracy is not merely doomed, it is doom itself. Fleeing it approaches an ultimate imperative. The subterranean current that propels such anti-politics is recognizably Hobbesian, a coherent dark enlightenment, devoid from its beginning of any Rousseauistic enthusiasm for popular expression. Predisposed, in any case, to perceive the politically awakened masses as a howling irrational mob, it conceives the dynamics of democratization as fundamentally degenerative, systematically consolidating and exacerbating private vices, resentments, and deficiencies until they reach the level of collective criminality and comprehensive social corruption. The democratic politician and the electorate are bound together by a circuit of reciprocal incitement, in which each side drives the other to ever more shameless extremities of hooting, prancing cannibalism, until the only alternative to shouting is being eaten. Where the progressive Enlightenment sees political ideals, the Dark Enlightenment sees appetites. It accepts that governments are made out of people, and that they will eat well. Setting its expectations as low as reasonably possible, it seeks only to spare civilization from frenzied, ruinous, gluttonous debauch. From Thomas Hobbes to Hans Hermann Hoppe and beyond, it asks, how can the sovereign power be prevented, or at least dissuaded, from devouring society? It consistently finds democratic solutions to this problem risible, at best. Hoppe advocates an anarcho-capitalist private law society, but between monarchy and democracy he does not hesitate, and his argument is strictly Hobbesian. As a hereditary monopolist, a king regards the territory and the people under his rule as his personal property and engages in the monopolistic exploitation of this property. Under democracy, monopoly and monopolistic exploitation do not disappear. Rather, what happens is this: instead of a king and a nobility who regard the country as their private property, a temporary and interchangeable caretaker is put in monopolistic charge of the country. The caretaker does not own the country, but as long as he is in office he is permitted to use it to his and his protégés' advantage. He owns its current use, usufruct, but not its capital stock. This does not eliminate exploitation. To the contrary, it makes exploitation less calculating and carried out with little or no regard to the capital stock. Exploitation becomes short-sighted and capital consumption will be systematically promoted. Political agents invested with transient authority by multi-party democratic systems have an overwhelming, and demonstrably irresistible, incentive to plunder society with the greatest possible rapidity and comprehensiveness. Anything they neglect to steal, or leave on the table is likely to be inherited by political successors who are not only unconnected, but actually opposed, and who can therefore be expected to utilize all available resources to the detriment of their foes. Whatever is left behind becomes a weapon in your enemy's hand. Best, then, to destroy what cannot be stolen. From the perspective of a democratic politician, any type of social good that is neither directly appropriable nor attributable to their own partisan policy is sheer waste, and counts for nothing, whilst even the most grievous social misfortune, so long as it can be assigned to a prior administration or postponed until a subsequent one, figures in rational calculations as an obvious blessing. The long-range techno-economic improvements and associated accumulation of cultural capital that constituted social progress in its old, Whig, sense are in nobody's political interest. Once democracy flourishes, they face the immediate threat of extinction. Civilization, as a process, is indistinguishable from diminishing time preference, or declining concern for the present in comparison to the future. Democracy, which both in theory and evident historical fact accentuates time preference to the point of convulsive feeding frenzy, is thus as close to a precise negation of civilization as anything could be, short of instantaneous social collapse into murderous barbarism or zombie apocalypse, which it eventually leads to. As the democratic virus burns through society, painstakingly accumulated habits and attitudes of forward-thinking, prudential, human and industrial investment, are replaced by a sterile, orgiastic consumerism, financial incontinence, and a reality television political circus. Tomorrow might belong to the other team, so it's best to eat it all now. Winston Churchill, who remarked in neo-reactionary style that the best argument against democracy is a 5-minute conversation with the average voter, is better known for suggesting that democracy is the worst form of government except all the others that have been tried. Whilst never exactly conceding that okay, democracy sucks, in fact, it really sucks, but what's the alternative? The implication is obvious. The general tenor of this sensibility is attractive to modern conservatives, because it resonates with their wry, disillusioned acceptance of relentless civilizational deterioration, and with the associated intellectual apprehension of capitalism as an unappetizing but ineliminable default social arrangement, which remains after all catastrophic or merely impractical alternatives have been discarded. The market economy, on this understanding, is no more than a spontaneous survival strategy that stitches itself together amidst the ruins of a politically devastated world. Things will probably just get worse forever. So it goes. So, what is the alternative? There's certainly no point trawling through the 1930s for one. Can you imagine a 21st century post-demodist society? One that saw itself as recovering from democracy, much as Eastern Europe sees itself as recovering from communism. Asks Supreme Sith Lord of the Neo-reactionaries, Mencius Moldbug. Well, I suppose that makes one of us. Moldbug's formative influences are Austro-libertarian, but that's all over. As he explains, libertarians cannot present a realistic picture of a world in which their battle gets won and stays won. They wind up looking for ways to push a world in which the state's natural downhill path is to grow back up the hill. This prospect is Sisyphean, and it's understandable why it attracts so few supporters. His awakening into neo-reaction comes with a Hobbesian recognition that sovereignty cannot be eliminated, caged, or controlled. Anarcho-capitalist utopias can never condense out of science fiction, divided powers flow back together like a shattered Terminator, and constitutions have exactly as much real authority as a sovereign interpretative power allows them to have. The state isn't going anywhere because, to those who run it, it's worth far too much to give up, and as the concentrated instantiation of sovereignty in society, nobody can make it do anything. If the state cannot be eliminated, Moldbug argues, at least it can be cured of democracy, or systematic and degenerative bad government, and the way to do that is to formalize it. This is an approach he calls neo-cameralism. To a neo-cameralist, a state is a business which owns a country. A state should be managed, like any other large business, by dividing logical ownership into negotiable shares, each of which yields a precise fraction of the state's profit. A well-run state is very profitable, each share has one vote, and the shareholders elect a board, which hires and fires managers. This business's customers are its residents. A profitably managed neo-cameralist state will, like any business, serve its customers efficiently and effectively. Misgovernment equals mismanagement. Firstly, it is essential to squash the democratic myth that a state belongs to the citizenry. The point of neo-cameralism is to buy out the real stakeholders in sovereign power, not to perpetuate sentimental lies about mass enfranchisement. Unless ownership of the state is formally transferred into the hands of its actual rulers, the neo-cameral transition will simply not take place, power will remain in the shadows, and the democratic farce will continue. So, secondly, the ruling class must be plausibly identified. It should be noted immediately, in contradistinction to Marxist principles of social analysis, that this is not the capitalist bourgeoisie. Logically, it cannot be. The power of the business class is already clearly formalized, in monetary terms, so the identification of capital with political power is perfectly redundant. It is necessary to ask, rather, who do capitalists pay for political favors, how much these favors are potentially worth, and how the authority to grant them is distributed. This requires, with a minimum of moral irritation, that the entire social landscape of political bribery, lobbying, is exactly mapped, and the administrative, legislative, judicial, media, and academic privileges accessed by such bribes are converted into fungible shares. Insofar as voters are worth bribing, there is no need to entirely exclude them from this calculation, although their portion of sovereignty will be estimated with appropriate derision. The conclusion of this exercise is the mapping of a ruling entity that is the truly dominant instance of the democratic polity. Moldbug calls it the cathedral. The formalization of political powers, thirdly, allows for the possibility of effective government. Once the universe of democratic corruption is converted into a freely transferable shareholding in GovCorp, the owners of the state can initiate rational corporate governance, beginning with the appointment of a CEO. As with any business, the interests of the state are now precisely formalized as the maximization of long-term shareholder value. There is no longer any need for residents, clients, to take any interest in politics whatsoever. In fact, to do so would be to exhibit semi-criminal proclivities. If GovCorp doesn't deliver acceptable value for its taxes, sovereign rent, they can notify its customer service function, and if necessary take their custom elsewhere. GovCorp would concentrate upon running an efficient, attractive, vital, clean, and secure country, of a kind that is able to draw customers. No voice, free exit. Although the full neo-cameralist approach has never been tried, its closest historical equivalents to this approach are the 18th century tradition of enlightened absolutism as represented by Frederick the Great, and the 21st century non-democratic tradition as seen in lost fragments of the British Empire such as Hong Kong, Singapore, and Dubai. These states appear to provide a very high quality of service to their citizens, with no meaningful democracy at all. They have minimal crime and high levels of personal and economic freedom. They tend to be quite prosperous. They are weak only in political freedom, and political freedom is unimportant by definition when government is stable and effective. In European classical antiquity, democracy was recognized as a familiar phase of cyclical political development, fundamentally decadent in nature, and preliminary to a slide into tyranny. Today this classical understanding is thoroughly lost, and replaced by a global democratic ideology, entirely lacking in critical self-reflection, that is asserted not as a credible social scientific thesis, or even as a spontaneous popular aspiration, but rather as a religious creed, of a specific, historically identifiable kind. A received tradition I call universalism, which is a non-theistic Christian sect. Some other current labels for this same tradition, more or less synonymous, are progressivism, multiculturalism, liberalism, humanism, leftism, political correctness, and the like. Universalism is the dominant modern branch of Christianity on the Calvinist line, evolving from the English dissenter or Puritan tradition through the Unitarian, Transcendentalist, and progressive movements. Its ancestral briar patch also includes a few sideways sprigs that are important enough to name but whose Christian ancestry is slightly better concealed, such as Rousseauvian laicism, Benthamite utilitarianism, Reformed Judaism, Comtean positivism, German idealism, Marxist scientific socialism, Sartrean existentialism, Heideggerian postmodernism, etc., etc., etc. Universalism, in my opinion, is best described as a mystery cult of power. It's as hard to imagine universalism without the state as malaria without the mosquito. The point is that this thing, whatever you care to call it, is at least 200 years old and probably more like 5. It's basically the Reformation itself, and just walking up to it and denouncing it as evil is about as likely to work as suing Shub Niggurath in small claims court. To comprehend the emergence of our contemporary predicament, characterized by relentless, totalizing, state expansion, the proliferation of spurious positive human rights, claims on the resources of others backed by coercive bureaucracies, politicized money, reckless evangelical wars for democracy, and comprehensive thought control arrayed in defense of universalistic dogma, accompanied by the degradation of science into a government public relations function, it is necessary to ask how Massachusetts came to conquer the world, as Moldbug does. With every year that passes, the international ideal of sound governance finds itself approximating more closely and rigidly to the standards set by the grievance studies departments of New England universities. This is the divine providence of the Randerson levelers, elevated to a planetary teleology, and consolidated as the reign of the cathedral. The cathedral has substituted its gospel for everything we ever knew. Consider just the concerns expressed by America's founding fathers, compiled by Liberty Klinger, comment number 1 here. A democracy is nothing more than mob rule, where 51% of the people may take away the rights of the other 49%, Thomas Jefferson. Democracy is 2 wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote, Benjamin Franklin. Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. John Adams. Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their death. James Madison. We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy. It has been observed that a pure democracy, if it were practicable, would be the most perfect government. Experience has proved that no position is more false than this. The ancient democracies in which the people themselves deliberated never possessed one good feature of government. Their very character was tyranny. Alexander Hamilton. More on voting with your feet, and the incandescent genius of Moldbug, next. Added note, March 7th. Don't trust the attribution of the Benjamin Franklin, above. According to Barry Popick, the saying was probably invented by James Bovard, in 1992. Bovard remarks elsewhere, there are few more dangerous errors in political thinking than to equate democracy with liberty.